Hey guys, so this is another video that I would like we said that this week we are going to talk about the question of migration and try to relate it with the question of cultural change. And I already discussed with you a little bit the conditions of acceleration and the kind of social and also kind of let's say material conditions it creates. So my point is in how far in this video is try to show in how far acceleration is related to the kind of transformations that we are seeing on a global level and how this might relate back to the issue of culture. And maybe a good way to picture that is if we go a little bit into two of the most important the last during the last 2 or 3 years, which is basically the migration crisis and the crisis around the coronavirus. I mean, like we are all locked in at the moment. So maybe it makes sense to have like a small conversation about this kind of issue. In fact, what you will see, or what you might have already noticed, is that some of the things that we discussed in class, like for example the concept of risk society by Ulrich Beck, is something that is very much relatable to the coronavirus crisis that we are living in at the moment. In fact, for Ulrich Beck, modernity is crucially related to risks and the let's say the increase of risks within society. And we can see in how far acceleration basically, I mean, like the things getting quicker and that we can travel further, and the kind of complexity of risks that we have within society are interrelated with each other. I mean, like think about it. The more people are traveling, the more people depend on each other and on the travels that they do, on the products that they send, on the kind of um, let's say production process, the way it is developed on a global level, the more risks might increase, or the more risks take a kind of a global component into account. Okay, so we can see that in terms of let's say, for example, these SEAT kind of company here in Barcelona area that stopped production not just because of the coronavirus itself, but partially also because they didn't have access to some of the raw materials that they need to continue with production because they are basically produced in China, and China has closed down factories. So we can see risks and problematics gain a global level on us in a certain form the more we are entering into a global accelerated society. So there's this kind of link. Okay. Another kind of thing that is related to global risks and acceleration is basically the kind of development of the concept of culture. So on the one hand side, I explained in another class that culture has increasingly become a mode to distinguish the world and we and others. And I've tried to explain in how far we have a kind of rebirth of culture within the current context of global society, in which we increasingly fall back to do our distinctions of who is with us, who is not part of us in terms of culture. What we can also see is that this kind of cultural components has allowed a certain kind of, or has facilitated a certain kind of flux of people. People are traveling because of culture, and that in different ways, right? So on the one hand side, we talked in another class about the question of tourism. Okay, so a lot of tourism is basically a consequence of people trying to travel and to experience difference, cultural difference. And I explained already in how far this is a backlog for the people in that places where they're actually traveling to. But the point is really that culture is an important component in terms of traveling. And on the one hand side, this is a consequence of technological acceleration, and it's a consequence probably of the acceleration of social change and of the pace of life. But on the other hand, it's also the other way around. The technological acceleration is what is a result of this kind of desire for intercultural experience or looking for intercultural experience. So we can really see in how far technology is basis and consequence of that kind of development. So we have talked about this kind of migration in a certain way. We have touched upon that when we talked about culture in a general way, when we talked about different kinds of strangers. We didn't talk so much about migration. And I think migration is one of those challenging topics that we might want to discuss these days, and it has a strong social component, and it gives a lot of like space for sociological reflection. Migration is a consequence of cultural change and of acceleration as well. Migration has become more necessary because of a more complex global world. It has become easier because of technological acceleration, but it has also become a consequence of the possibility of global exploitation. And in fact, in order to understand why a lot of people migrate, already in the 70s, people discussed about improving the material and economic conditions within those places where people are migrating from. One of the reasons, or one of the things that should be discussed here really is the still impacting consequences of imperialism and colonialism. And it's interesting, and I do not want to mess around here, but it's interesting. I was in one of the quite an important UN meeting, and I heard people, high-ranking people from the UN, discussing about in how far people from ex-colonial countries shouldn't continue, like blaming Western countries for what they actually did to them, but rather be, thankful and just move on and do not put the blame on them and use this as an excuse for their own development. But in fact, if you look at most of the, let's say, more Marxist kind of global theories, thinking about Emmanuel Wallerstein, Sami Amin, different kinds of authors that have discussed global the economy and of global exploitation, we can see in how far part of that migration is really a consequence of this kind of economic and also cultural exploitation of the world. And I think this is something that we have to take really into account. So, I mean, like, we really have to think on this kind of level about this kind of different levels of hierarchies that we can find in the world. I mean, like, if we think about Amin and Wallerstein, they discuss about a part that is considered the center of the world. Then there's like a semi-peripheral area, and there's a peripheral area where we are basically having very different economic, social, and cultural conditions for people being there. So this is another important component that needs to be taken into account. A third component, that's the last one for this video, is basically in how far we have a need to, in a certain form, learn certain kinds of cultural forms of behavior in order to interact well with business partners around the world. So if you're going to Thailand or you're going to Japan, it might be necessary to adapt to specific practices that they carry out there in order to make business friendships. So there are certain kinds of behaviors, of cultural behaviors, that we have to learn in order to become effective communicators. And effective communication depends a lot of understanding these kind of like differences in cultural patterns. So these are like the three elements that are related to complexity of global movements or flux of people. And I touched here a bit on the context of migration, which is one of the important elements. Okay, I'm leaving it here for this video, and I look forward to hearing comments and questions. See you later.